Next, we're going to look at a technique for doing classification or regression. It's very different from what we've discussed thus far. It's not a linear classifier or a linear regression technique. It's something called decision trees. So a decision tree maps an input x in RD to an output y, which could be either a real value or a class, using a sequence of binary decision rules. So we have a tree, and each node in the tree has a splitting rule, or if it's a leaf node, it has a decision rule. And each splitting rule is going to be of the form, look at the jth dimension of x. So in this case, j is indexing the dimension of x for this slide. And if it's greater than t, go in one direction down the tree. If it's less than t, go a different direction. So for example, look at the first dimension of x. If it's greater than 1.7, go to the left. If it's less than 1.7, go to the right. If we go to the left, we hit a leaf node, and that leaf node is going to tell us, okay, you've terminated, declare class 1. If we go to the right, for this specific example, we would look at the second dimension of x. If it's greater than 2.8, we go to the left, and because we hit a leaf, we declare 2. If the second dimension is less than 2.8, we go to the right. Again, we hit a leaf, we declare class 3. So this would be a three-class classification problem where we need to look at these two dimensions of x according to this sequential splitting rule in order to make a decision. The motivation behind regression trees and classification trees, decision trees in general, is that we want to take the input space, so this is the space that we've been calling that x lives in, the covariate space or the feature space, and we want to partition it into regions so that all data that falls within the same region has exactly the same prediction. So for regression or classification, if a data point falls within a particular region, any part of that region, it's going to have the same exact prediction. So the goal of a decision tree is to take the input space and partition it into regions. If we wanted to partition the input space into regions in general, we might say this would be a partition that we want. However, we could quickly convince ourselves that this type of a region is not something we can get with a binary decision tree. So the partitions that we're interested in for the purpose of this lecture are those that can be defined by binary splitting trees. So not all partitions of the input space are going to be possible with the technique we're going to discuss. And the reason for that is because a binary decision tree is something that's very easy to learn, and it's a very simple rule, something that's very easy to do. So these are the types of partitions that we're going to be able to get with a binary decision tree. If we want to represent a split like this in terms of a decision tree, we can visualize it like this, where, for example, we would first look at the first dimension of x and see if it's less than or greater than t1. If it's less than t1, we go to the left, in which case we now have these two regions that are possible. At less than t2, then we're in region 1. If it's greater than t2, we know we're in region 2. So all five of these regions can be easily found by following the rules of this decision tree. If we have a new input x and we want to say which of the 5 regions does this x fall in, we can quickly find it according to this decision tree. Whereas if we just had this sort of a representation, if we had some other way of representing this, it might be much more complicated to actually find out, especially if the data is in much higher dimensions, which of the regions does it fall in. The decision tree can give us that extremely fast. So that's why we allow ourselves to be constrained to the regions that can be defined by a binary decision tree. And then if we're doing regression, we have a partition, for example, like this. So here, this plane is the bottom of this cube. And then for a particular region, for example, R1, every data point in that region will be predicted to have this value. So y is now, this third dimension is now the output y that we're going to predict. Any data that falls in this region, R2, will predict y to be 0. Any data that falls in R1 will have this prediction. And so we can see that with these regression trees, we are taking the space and learning these sort of step functions to try to model the data. For classification, it's essentially the same. For example, let's look at this classification problem where we have irises, and the irises that we want to predict can fall into one of three classes. So there are three different types of irises. The way that we make this prediction is by taking an iris and measuring two features. So we extract two features from a particular iris. We extract the sepal length divided by the sepal width. So one of these is a petal, one of these is a sepal. I don't remember exactly which is which, but we have petals and we have sepals in these irises. And so we take a petal and we calculate the length of the petal divided by the width and average that over all the petals. That gives us one feature for that particular iris. And then we do the same with the sepals. We take the length divided by the width and average. That gives us a second feature. And then we plot these for many irises, for 100 or so irises. And then we color code it by the class that they fall in, and we get something like this. So for example, the red class of irises, what we're calling red X's, all have the two-dimensional features that fall in this region, whereas the blue class and the green class are distributed this way. So this is actually, in addition to our conversation about decision trees, is a good place to discuss the ideas of feature extraction. So we have a bunch of irises, and we have labels for those irises. Some expert has told us what each iris is. But now we want to have a quick way of taking a new iris and predicting what class it belongs to. So we have to extract features from each iris in order to do something like this. If we just had a picture and wanted to analyze the picture somehow, it would be much, much more complicated. So we've taken a complex object and we've defined a rule for getting two numbers that can represent that object: the ratio of the sepal length versus width and the ratio of the petal length versus width. And now we've taken a particular iris and we've reduced it to those two numbers. So this iris might be reduced to that number, right, that point right there. Let's look now, just as an example, a walkthrough, what would a decision tree on this type of a data set look like for classification. So first, imagine that we have the trivial tree where there's just one node. So there's not even a decision that needs to be made. We simply want to predict which class each point belongs to. In that case, what we would do is we would predict, again, the most probable class. So we basically say that there's one region and all data fall into that same exact region. And because class 2 is the most probable class, we declare every point in that region to be class 2. Now if we want to have a decision tree that only has one decision in it, we might, for example, say, okay, look at the first dimension, and now if a data point is greater than 1.7, so that's this line here, if the first dimension is greater than 1.7, it's in one region. If it's less than 1.7, it's in a different region. So now we've divided the space into two regions. And for this particular region, for this region here, we're now going to come up with a prediction of all the data in this region. We simply make the prediction to be the most prevalent class. In this case, Y1 is the most prevalent class in this region, whereas in the second region, the most prevalent class could be Y3. Now we want to make another split. And so in this case, we wouldn't want to split this region because it's perfectly classified. But if we split this region, for example, if we split R2 along the second dimension, where we look at whether a point has its second dimension valued greater than 2.8, so that's this region, or less than 2.8, so that's this region. Then we could make another split. So we haven't split the entire space along this point. We're just looking at the second region and making a split along this dimension. The first region would be reached if we went in this direction, in which case we don't ever make another split. So that's why this split is only taking this entire region and partitioning it into two parts. And now we would look, is it greater than 2.8? If it is, we go to the left and we have class 2. That's the most prevalent class. And if it's less, we go to the right. We have class 3. That's the most prevalent.